Hello, and thank you for listening to Macon Atlanta, where we're in conversation with Atlanta innovators and community builders. I'm your host, Brent Macon, and today's episode with Black Health co-founder Matthew McCurdy is perfect for anyone thinking about what should we be rooting for in this AI era, specifically when it comes to population health outcomes and Black health outcomes. I learned a ton from Matthew. Enjoy this episode. But you mentioned the definition of public health and looking it up. What is public health? What isn't public health? Like, how do you define it?
I'm probably overly broad in my definition of public health. I think everything is public health, right? I think
that's pretty broad.
Yeah, right. Like I think everything has a contribution to individuals' ability to be healthy, which then is our collective ability to be healthy. And so, public health to me is the field of ensuring that people can live the best, like the healthiest lives, and doing that really from a systems level, right? Like changing structures, changing policies, health education, all of these things I think are tools of public health. But at the end of the day, our goal is to build the healthiest society.
And so from master's in public health to founding Black Health, can you talk about that journey, what Black Health is, and how you decided to make that the focus?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to my journey in finding public health, I got into school, so I ended up going to the Emory Rollins School of Public Health, and quickly found out that, confirmed my suspicions. Right, we're seeing more death in Black and brown communities. We're seeing more disease. It's not being treated well, and it's been happening for a long time. At the same time, we started to see police brutality sort of hit the news stream, right? And so, of course, Trayvon Martin was slightly before I started school, but Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland was also one that was kind of fishy. But a number of different police murders or police brutality incidents. And then we being the Association of Black Public Health Students at Emory, wanted to have a conversation, right? Between that connection of police violence and health. We were met with pushback, both from other students in our program, the university itself. And I think that really made us realize, again, this is a top 5 university, sure, a very, very white place in Georgia. So also we're in a very conservative state, but supposed to be the premier public health institution, right? And if we aren't seeing students connect violence, death as a public health problem, then people aren't broadly making these connections either, outside of sort of research and people who study that for a living. So we started to have conversations on campus. We started to hold the university accountable. Hey, what we see here is not only that there is a issue connecting things that are happening in Black communities to health outcomes, we're also not adequately addressing racism as a public health issue, right? And racism exists both in sort of the space of brutality, but also how we frame and respond to police brutality, right? And so if people don't understand or can't empathize with a group of people feeling like they're being targeted by the state, that's leading to early death, leading to trauma, leading to mental health issues for a community, then I think that in itself is a form of racism, right? At racism at worst, and sort of just othering at the least, right? And so we started again to have conversations to try to hold people accountable on campus. We had a big racism and health symposium that we planned, and then we just started to say, hey, how can we extend this, right? And so upon graduation, myself and 3 of my co-founders, we wanted to start an organization. Really, that initial impetus was we want to educate people on that connection between racism and health, right? We want to teach people what racism is. And racism is not I do something bad to someone else, I call someone a slur. That is a form of racism, right? But really this sort of structural, systemic racism, how it exists in our policies, how it exists in the way that policies are carried out and put forth, how it exists. And I say policy from the standpoint of big P policy, that comes down from the government, but also, company policies, hiring policies, the way that people are supported once they're hired, the way that resources are allocated throughout communities. And so we did a lot of that early on education, and then, sort of have grown from there to developing our own programming, doing our own education. So we also have fellowships where we're training students. So we're doing a number of different really, really cool things. But really it was started from, how can we push forward this conversation on the connection of racism and health?
Sure. Who's the buyer and what are they buying? If that's the right way to think about it.
Yeah. So we're a nonprofit. And so the buyer, I think one is companies looking to work with Black communities, right? And so we see pharmaceutical companies, we work with physician groups, we work with hospital systems, we work with institutions of higher education. And I'd say for pharmaceutical companies, what they're buying is access to Black communities in ways that are culturally appropriate, ways that deliver impact, and are still centered on community. I know that companies don't know how to work with communities, whether they're Black, white, indigenous, Latin.
Yeah, it feels like it ends up cringy more often than...
And also not delivering any impact, right? I don't think the actual incentives are aligned, right? At the end of the day, most companies are trying to sell a product. And so what you get is some media campaign that uses, a person of color and then doesn't actually deliver any impact to those communities. Sure, it may raise awareness, but we're not creating any change.
Yeah. Can you give me a tangible example of like where that's fallen short?
Yep.
And then maybe a success story from y'all's work that has moved the needle to a better outcome?
Yeah. I mean, the classic example is like there was a campaign that was developed in New York City around large drinks, right? We want to put an extra tax on large drinks because it's creating an obesity epidemic, right? And sure, soda is bad. But what the media campaign did was show a bunch of overweight people, right? And a bunch of Black and brown overweight people. And so one, it's targeting people, right, who are actually the victims of the system, right? And sure, we make our own decisions, right? But like, if we are selling products that we know are bad for people, we can't, that have sugar in them, which is a highly addictive substance, we then can't blame the people for buying those products, right? They're accessible, they're everywhere. And then the campaign was a fat shaming campaign, right? And so, what we often want to do is target the actors that need to change, right? And so, sure, we can put a tax and make it harder for people to buy, but what we actually should be doing is creating laws and policies that restrict the production of that, right? And where that is sold, or we put labels on those products so that people have information on how they're poorly, attributing to their health. So I'd say an example from our work where we're actually trying to deliver impact, we have a program with Advil. And so Advil wants to raise awareness on bias in healthcare. They come to us and say, hey, we really want to create a program that's tied to messaging, tied to advertising. But we don't know how to create and deliver education, right? And so our job in this particular instance is one, to inform their communication strategy, right? And so we're like deliberating on ads that are going out. We are contributing to some of the creative discussion on like how we're actually framing this problem and this argument. And then we're naming who needs to change, right? And so it's not that if the problem is that Black people don't want to engage with the healthcare system, our job isn't to fix Black people. Our job is to fix the healthcare system, right? And why people don't want to engage. And so we're also developing a curriculum. We've developed a curriculum that is being taught in med schools. And so we're partnered with Morehouse School of Medicine. We'll hopefully be partnering with other schools in the future. And the real goal of that course is to teach and educate our future physicians and our future healthcare providers on their bias, and then how to mitigate that bias most importantly, right? And so teaching things like the talk back method or the teach back method. So what did you hear me say? Can you tell me how you're going to enact this in your everyday life? And then, I think higher up, we're also thinking about how do we change incentives, right? Right now, care is really designed on seeing the maximum amount of people in the day.
Sure.
But if we can transition to a value-based system where people where systems are sort of awarded and rewarded for the care that they deliver and the outcomes that we see in their population, then that's a different change. And so we're also advocating for those policies and with the support of Advil, right? And so we've moved from a system where we're like blaming people for their health decisions in a world that makes the unhealthy decision the easiest decision, to a multi-level solution where you get your ads, you get the public awareness, you get the publicity of being, on the right side of this issue, but we're also delivering impact to community. We're advocating for long-term change. And I don't think that Advil sort of takes that route without our consultation and our work with them.
Well, I do have a question written. How do you think about success? And also what I wrote down was, if you think about the hierarchy of health, where do you all, try to play and what's the focus? Yeah. And you can take that in either direction that you want, but it definitely, like you said, it's a huge ocean of public health and you got a boat, and it may not be the biggest boat that you want right now, but still what you're trying to do. So like, how do you think about success and where you're trying to get to?
Yeah. Success for me, I think I have to define it a few different ways. Being able to deliver something that someone would have needed to wait a long time, really sort of just easing that path to a health resource or a health information, right? And so that can be changes in knowledge, skills, behavior, right? So, hey, this is new information that I'm now going to take action on. I think that is a success metric. I say higher level is, what I talked about earlier. I had to change behavior, right? So I learned about colorectal cancer screening. I got screened for colorectal cancer. They found cancer and I was able to get treatment, have the cancer removed, right? Doing that at an individual level is a success metric. Doing that at a community level, right? Even if people don't find they have cancer, just being able to get screened is a successful metric. I think where I want to go is, hey, we've expanded access to healthcare for Georgians, right? So previously we advocated for this policy. We were part of this larger group, and now people have more access to low cost healthcare, right? Or people have in-home resources that are now able to make them healthier, right? And so we're starting a program on radon testing, for example, right? And so if we can distribute 50,000 radon kits throughout the community, people find out whether or not they're being exposed, which then would be an increase for risk of cancer, lung cancer particularly, and then sort of mitigating that would be a success metric. I am not going to improve life expectancy, right, in my lifetime. But I'm in it for the long game, right? Like even outside of my existence on this planet, how can I contribute to the incremental steps to pushing this forward, pushing this work forward, right? And so I'm always reminding myself that I'm a part of a legacy, and I'm also building a legacy that someone else can hopefully contribute to as well.
Yeah. And you mentioned kind of carrying this agenda and this vanguard of Black population health. What are the success metrics of that ideology and that agenda? Is it equal health span, equal life expectancy?
Equal life expectancy, I think, is the metric. For me, it's the reduction of disparities, right? The elimination of disparities ultimately, right? So if we're seeing Black populations getting X disease at higher rates, and not only getting X disease, it's then dying from X disease, right? And so we're overexposed both from a standpoint of morbidity, right? So getting sicker or getting sick more frequently, and then mortality. So dying sooner, dying earlier, right? So I think it's both reducing the burden of disease incidence and then ensuring that people are able to live longer lives, or at least equal lives to other races, ethnicities.
Yeah. What do you want me and the well-intentioned white moderate around Atlanta like me to think about your organization, and then kind of the need for it more broadly?
Yeah. I'll start with the need, because I think that's more important. I think the fact is, in its simplest terms, here in Atlanta, Metro Atlanta, Black people have less access to the information and resources that would make them healthy. And the result of that lack of access is increased disease and increased death. And I think that's the simplest way I can put it. And then the action or the question is, do you care? Right? Does that mean anything to you? That there are people who are your neighbors, right? That are going to have worse health outcomes because of racism, right? And there's all sort of intersecting forms of oppression, right? So we can talk about classism, we can talk about, issues around sexuality and gender. But racism as a foundational cause of health outcomes, like, do you care? And if the answer is yes, then I think the next question is, what can you do, right? So what skills, what talents, what resources do you have to bring to solving that problem? And how can you partner with organizations like Black Health, or many of the organizations who are working on this in Atlanta, to help solve the issue? How can we help hold our government accountable to helping solve the issue, right? That would be my message. Do you care? And if you do care, what are you prepared to do?
Yeah. And suppose that enough folks answer yes, and there's enough mobilization of resources and otherwise towards, let's call it solutions, programs, interventions that reflect that care.
Yep.
What would you want to be different? What would you want it to look like? What does good look like in Atlanta that closes that information and access and ultimately outcome gap?
Yeah. And I think this is a question that I've been pondering, right? What is our imagination of that new future, right? What does that actually look like? I go back to Dr. King's beloved community, right? When we think about how we take care of each other, how we're in each other's lives, how we care for each other, how we are not only advocating and holding accountable for the things that impact us, but also impact others. How our government is responsive to the needs of the people. How corporations, right? I think a lot about how much corporations take from us, right? Our resources, our money. Are they actually doing good in community? Are they giving that back? Are the value that we're handing over increasing their profit shares, increasing the amount of money they have? Are they actually providing goods and services that benefit community? Are they going the extra mile? Like I think, there's no reason. I think about MailChimp a lot because my mom worked for MailChimp. Those guys sold MailChimp and they both became billionaires, right? And I just think about how much $1 billion could change the health and well-being of people in Atlanta, and not just Black people, right? I think all people, right? We know that there's a ton of people suffering. Yeah, I feel like I'm going on a tangent, but yeah, I think there's a social contract that would look different, right? And that social contract between how our government, how we're accountable to each other, how corporations that make their bread, make their money here in Atlanta are accountable to the health and well-being of the population here in Atlanta. I think it would be a restructuring of all of those relationships, with the ultimate goal of, increase health and well-being for people.
Yeah. I think about it a lot in the context of kids enrichment and kids wellness.
Yep.
So owning little gym franchises, I'm in the business of the privatization of kids enrichment and kids development, right? Mm-hmm. And in some ways that strikes me as a good thing because parents can choose. Is it swim school, or is it gymnastics, or is it martial arts, or is it piano lessons, or none of the above? Provided that they have the means to choose and an opportunity near them, right? And so part of me is like, all right, well, more power and agency to the parents. That seems to work out well. Mm-hmm. You look at public school systems, rarely are they thriving. And I think the absence of market incentives kind of hurts in an environment like that. It's not a great place to be a teacher long-term. There's not a promotion track and otherwise.
Yep.
What if we just had more opportunities between technology and privatized child enrichment to let folks choose and go that route? So I can articulate the school voucher, school choice type argument. Mm-hmm. And part of me is like, but what if we just funded the heck out of public schools? And so then they weren't defanged. Yep. And so it might actually be an institution that's more robust. And I can talk in a circle on that.
I get that. I get that argument. Not even, it's not an argument, but I get that sort of frame, as I was thinking, like, wouldn't it be great if, even for your business, right, if everyone was given a voucher for child enrichment, right? And hey, Brent, here's my voucher that I received this year. I want to sign my son up for the little gym, right? That's an investment not only in children, right, and their future, but also in creating opportunities in small businesses for folks to also take advantage of that. We do that with public housing, right? But then there also needs to be a standard of quality, because our health and well-being systems are mostly tied to business ventures, right? Tied to capitalism. Those who are well-resourced are always going to benefit more. And what we see for a lot of communities of color, Black communities in particular, is that overexposed to poverty in relation to other races, right? And so you are less resourced to take advantage of these opportunities, and those opportunities aren't even going to be in your community, right? Because of the density requirements, because of the income level requirements. We see the same thing for grocery stores. We see the same thing for health, like literal health clinics, right? Like, do we have an actual population that can afford, that actually has insurance, to be able to take advantage of these resources? And they close, right? We see them closing all across rural Georgia, health clinics and health systems in particular. But then when we think about these additional resources, like your well-being spas, your yoga studios, your grocery stores that have, low processed and organic foods, those are not in the communities that actually need them the most, because they can't afford them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What would you say to somebody who, going back to our question about the white moderate, who says, yes, I agree with you, and I think it is bullshit that if you travel 5 miles in Atlanta, the life expectancy goes from 63 Sudan in south part of Atlanta to like 85 Switzerland, the north part of Atlanta, and the difference in demographic is Black folks and white folks. That does not sit right. There's no way it's consistent with MLK's vision of love and community. There's no way it's consistent with what Jesus is preaching. Like that does not feel right. I care. And what am I prepared to do with that care? The number one thing that I would likely be asked to do is fork over more tax dollars that I don't trust a government entity to redistribute those well. And it's likely to not correct those systemic factors. And so if anything, what I'm basically doing is taking from my family to redistribute in a hope that it might work, but I don't believe that it will.
Yeah. There are other mechanisms and avenues outside of government, right? And especially if we're thinking about creating impact in our lifespan, right? Sure, restructuring of government accountability will take a long time. But there are nonprofits, there are mutual aid groups, there are community organizers who are doing this work to provide resources, and you can have a direct impact. You can adopt a family, right? And I think there are people who are doing the work on the ground who need further support. There are organizations who need time, expertise, and resources. They need people who can advocate for them, right? Advocate for their communities. And so it's about leaving your house, leaving your community, finding those people who are doing that work, and then asking them, how can I support you? How can I better serve the work that you're doing? And there are people who are doing things that folks are aligned with, right? So if you're really interested in mental health, right, there are organizations and nonprofits doing great mental health work. If you're interested in child well-being and enrichment, like there are organizations doing that work as well. And so I think the easy thing is often to say, yeah, sure, I'd pay more taxes, but I don't trust that they're going in the right place. The more difficult thing is to create community with people who don't look like you, who don't have the same experience as you. And that takes time, that takes intentionality. But that's how we build a new future, one that doesn't rely on or need the government in order to create change.
Yeah, the getting out of the house, that feels like a tough moment, getting tougher. But I'm with you. Depending on the room I'm in, left, center left, or far left, depending on who I'm around in comparison. And a book club of mine read the book, The Right. And it was a very in-depth, thick history of the American conservative movement from, call it late 1800s through Trump. And what I didn't get until I read that book and had that conversation is how intertwined the fear of communism, state control, and racism have been in policies. Where I would have thought about, I thought about the anti-communism stuff being like the McCarthyism era and kind of isolated to that. But it has been a theme since before World War I. And the racism kind of self-evident. And then the way that those have intertwined is that a lot of the advances that were proposed for Black people required government intervention and then were pushed back on in the name of, hey, we got to limit state overreach, because once you concede power and authority to the state, it very rarely ever comes back to the people. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes those moved in sinister lockstep, where it was like, we're deliberately keeping Black folks down because we don't want them to rise. And other times it was like, that's a byproduct of, let's make sure that we don't give the state unchecked power and unchecked control. And I'm sympathetic to half of that argument. Like, I don't want to live in a communist country or a socialist country. I don't want to be told like what line of work I can or can't go into. I think that there is more prosperity for everyone when there's a robust market. But at the same time, when the game shakes out with such clear winners and losers of the game, we got to be able to say, all right, something's wrong with the game. Let's fix it. And so what I'm ideologically drawn to, that I don't know if it's fair and true and possible, is like, is there a well-regulated capitalism that is fair for everyone and manages to have robust state-run entities like public school systems that at the same time doesn't lead to us paying 70% tax that then limits personal agency and freedom of choice for where we live, how we live, what occupations we become, and otherwise, and ultimately limits our potential long term. So that's what I would want to find. Yeah. And I I don't know that I necessarily see anyone articulating that well.
I'd argue, no, I think you're right. Right. I think our capitalism, specifically American capitalism, has been racialized capitalism, right? With the earliest injury of slavery, right? So I forget the figure, but you can imagine millions, billions, trillions of dollars attributed to that initial free labor, right? Long term over the course of our history, right? And so our capitalist structure has always been a racialized capitalist structure, right? Like how can we deliver profits, income to white men while simultaneously keeping our labor force tied to the system, poor, and in their jobs, right? And you're exactly right. Like, I think we see that tied to, and then the argument,
and dependent. I would use the word dependent.
Yeah, I think that's a great word. And so the argument for socialism then is not as it's a substitute, but it's also like a rectifying force to undo that initial injury, right? And so we need more taxes so that more people can have access to resources, right? We need certainly socialized medicine, because if not, again, the market incentives are aligned to keep people dependent, to keep profit into the pockets of the few, while continuously drawing from the pockets of the many. So I think in a vacuum, there is a society that could be created, but just based on our history, there is no reason for billionaires to give up their power, right? And we see that playing out right now with sort of the billionaire class and the influence they're having over our current politics.
Yeah, I think the only way that it works is if folks who win the capitalist game are so moved to redistribute, whether they are so moved from a religious or philosophical perspective would be the ideal.
Yeah.
Because then it's like a voluntary, loving gift exchange of redistribution and seeding the next thing that can come to be. Or it's all right, we got to have that because we need it. And so we're coming for it.
We're coming for it.
Yeah. Right. And that's where I think that definitely plays out in a less positive way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we see it in all the fantasy novels and stories, right? Like, and I mean, we've had rebellions, right? This country is built on a rebellion against the oligarchy, right? And also the church and a number of different things. But to your earlier point, I think people are just very, very comfortable now, right? And we're distracted by media. We're distracted by entertainment. And so we don't actually have to deal with these issues because it's very easy to, I got to go to work. I come home. I got to watch my show. I'm going to bed. I'm waking up tomorrow and doing it again. And we're just not civically engaged. We're not engaged with other people in the strife and the issues that are happening in our community. And I'm making broad blanket statements, but I do think that we have been intentionally conditioned to be distracted.
Yeah.
And I struggle with that a lot because, I like television. I like movies.
Yeah, we talk about the Atlanta Hawks.
Right.
Yeah.
I love basketball, but I do think that a more civically engaged community would be one that, for lack of better phrasing and to get to the original meaning of the word, is like a more woke society, right? Like we are seeing what's happening and we are actively trying to change it.
So I'm curious, how do you decide what tenor to strike in your messaging, especially as it relates to power? Like, how do you decide how, you just mentioned the word rebellion, like how radical to be in either opposing or trying to change the systems and power that are currently in place and how to relate to those?
I don't know if it's a conscious thing. I think what I've been told is a gift of mine is communicating. I think, sure, like tear this whole thing down, right? Like that I would, but that's not one.
But do you believe that?
Do I believe that we need a new system? Yes. And will that new system require tearing down the old system? Yes. So short answer, yes. Do I see the feasibility of that without massive casualties? Right. Literal casualty. Yeah. People will have to die. I don't think there is a world where we don't have enough guns, armor, right? Like there's like the system is set up, and then we see that from the executive department or not, right? They're actually ignoring the judiciary because they have no means of enforcement, right? What are you actually going to do to us? And I think there were certainly revolutionaries, radicals who were like, some people are going to have to die, and that is what is required for systems change. My heart's not there. And so for me, it's how do we create the most good within this system? I don't know if I am the leader that is pushing for that rebellion. And that might not be the right approach, right? I think there are certainly critiques of working within systems, incremental change, trying to change systems slowly. Revolutionaries are, revolutionaries for that very reason, right? They're reimagining new systems and trying to force them. But they are assassinated and killed as well. And I kind of like living. And so I think that sort of personal safety is also maybe part of the calculus as well. Safety of my family, my community. But I also want to speak truth to power, right? And I want to tell the truth about my experiences, anecdotally, what the data shows, what I've heard from other people's lived experiences, and then communicate that in a way that people can understand and connect with. And I think that that's really my gift and my superpower is building that connection so that people can understand, also don't feel, maybe it's offended, right? I talk a lot about responsibility versus guilt. Yeah. Right. Like
guilted is the right word.
Yeah. Guilted. Yeah.
We know each other through Lead Atlanta. You're running an organization called Black Health. I know from the beginning that I'm not the target market. And if anything, I'm potentially the perpetrator. Yep. And there could be a tenor and tone that you could have in that work that would make me feel like Matthew wants no part of me. And it's very unlikely that we're having this conversation and able to bridge any potential divide and come to any kind of common understanding. Yep. And the retort to that I can appreciate is, hey, historical colonizer, you don't get to set the rules so that you don't feel uncomfortable. Right. Right. Yep. But also like the practical reality is like, cool. But the absence of that is us not being together and me feeling like, oh, this dude's like coming at me or coming for me. Like, I don't want to be in conversation with that. And that's how people will feel. Yeah.
And I think that's where we get, right? I think a lot of the pushback against DEI and anti-racism now is like, it's not, I shouldn't feel guilty for things that my ancestors did. And I'm not asking people to feel guilty. I'm asking people to take responsibility. Sure. Right. And those things are different. Right. And again, that responsibility isn't necessarily because of the legacy of colonialism or the legacy of slavery. It's really about, again, do you care about the people in your community, right? And do you believe their experiences? And I think that's where I really struggle with is like, people are telling you what they're experiencing, what they're going through, and either you don't believe them and therefore you sort of invalidating that experience, or you don't care. Or you believe and you care, you just don't feel empowered to do anything. Yeah. And I think I'm trying to walk people along that continuum towards action.
Yeah. I think it's impossible to look at the qualitative and quantitative data and suggest there's not a problem. Yep. It's pretty darn impossible to not obviously connect that to the history of our country.
Yep.
It's also hard to adhere to any higher order religious or moral philosophy and say, yeah, that problem that we just identified doesn't matter. I'm cool with it.
Yep.
And so then you get to, okay, we've established the need for care. And then it's like for me to care.
Yep.
And then it's, is there an accessible lever that I believe will be impactful that I can contribute to mobilize my care?
Yep.
For lack of a better word.
And I also, believe we have to we have to simplify it, right? Again, like help one person, right? Commit to helping one family, right? I think we all tend to try to take on large scale problems and large scale change. And sure, there are people and that's their job and their responsibility, but how can you help your neighbor? How can you help, the 10 people that live on your block? Or if it's you don't have any people on your block that feel you need that help, how can you go somewhere else? And how can you organize people that you are with to then go adopt or support another community? And I think we make it more difficult than it has to be. There are many.
Yeah, you don't have to quit your job to be a freedom fighter.
Right. You don't have to quit your job. Right. You don't have to, it's a value proposition, a value decision about where you spend your time and your energy. And certainly you're going to take away from other parts of your life to do that. But I think, again, do you care and is it worth it?
Yeah. A lot of times I wish when I was having conversations like this or even on podcasts that there was like a well-intentioned conservative sitting right here who could articulate the traditionally conservative message, but not from so often right now I feel like it's articulated in a closed off way, but in like an open way, in a well-intentioned way. And I'll try to put that hat on a little bit now. Sure. And I also know that you have interacted with Stoic philosophy, very much around personal agency, controlling what's within our control. And that word that we used earlier, dependency, an argument that I'm sympathetic to is that by shifting responsibility away from the person who's picking up the 32-ounce soda and towards the entity that's creating the soda, then you're kind of removing personal agency from that human who has choice. And you're placing you're not responsible for what you're doing. Let's place the blame on systems or historical factors or ancestors and a whole myriad of things that might be contributing in concert with the decision that you're making at the end of the day and the ultimate decision at the moment of, purchase and consumption for that soda that we were talking about earlier. How do you square those and see the role of both personal agency and systems in that without leading towards a place where we're just dependent on the government or some other entity telling us what we can and can't do and kind of ceding some of that unique human agency and capability? Does that make sense?
It does, right? I think there's a multitude of factors, but we'll talk about 3 for this particular situation. One is the corporation, business that is producing the product. 2 is the individual. 3 is the government. The government regulates things all the time, right? We have seatbelts because of government intervention. We don't smoke indoors anymore because public health recognized it was an issue. Government then stepped in to enforce it, right? I think left up to our own agency, people are going to choose the unhealthy option. Oftentimes, if it's the easy option, if it's marketed towards me, if I see it on my television time and time again, it's a pretty color. It's nice. I'm talking particularly about soda, right? And so I do think it's the government's responsibility to regulate, right? Certainly things that are causing harm. Do I also think that we have to have some personal responsibility for the lifestyle we choose? Yeah, absolutely. Like I'm not saying that it's the government and corporations' jobs to make all of the decisions for people, right? But what we know, particularly when it comes to health and our health behaviors around nutrition, around what we put in our bodies, we are choosing the things that are easiest, that are making our bodies feel good, sugar, fats and other things like that. And then what's accessible to us, what we can afford, right? And so to make this a bit more concrete, when we think about grocery deserts or food deserts, there's another term called food swamps, right? So where we actually see a abundance of unhealthy food in the community, right? And so if I need to drive 5 miles, assuming I have a car, right, to get healthy foods, but there's a McDonald's walking distance from my place, there's a convenience store, I am going to choose that option, right? Because I can walk there, because it's accessible, and it's also at a price point that I can afford, right? Based off of my income level. And so it's about creating environments where the healthy decision is the easier decision, right? And so that is a government intervention to realign market incentives. And that's the way that I think about sort of those things connecting, right? So if my behavioral decision is I want to eat something unhealthy, it should be just as easy as I want to eat something healthy, right? And so I think I use sort of food and nutrition because I think that's an easy example for folks to understand. But we see, like seatbelts, indoor smoking. Government is regulating what companies can put into their food. We just saw the elimination of red dye, for example, in some foods, right?
Yay.
Exactly, right? And so
now do everything else.
And then this sort of like microplastics issue as well, right? What we see again from a conservative perspective is they prefer deregulation because regulation is expensive, right? It costs money for me to change product, to create a healthier product. Maybe the actual healthier things or components of that product are at a higher price point than the less healthy components. And so again, we're choosing profit over people, consistently choosing profit over people, right? And I think again, the questions or the bullets that I sent you earlier, like who is responsible for population health? Is it the government's job? And to me, it is, right? I see probably the number one indicator of a government doing its job well is that its people are healthy, right? Because that enables everything else. But I think often we're choosing, are we making money? Is the country profitable? Is our GDP where it needs to be? But if your people are dying, then to me, that's a failed government. If your people are sick, that's a failed government. There's a book that I've been reading, or I just finished, Democracy in the Time of Coronavirus, by Danielle Allen. And she actually talks about the founding documents of our country. So Constitution, Declaration of Independence. And really, we interpret often those early documents about liberty, right? Our ability to choose, our freedom to do as we please in this country. But she is actually forcing a second interpretation, that not only is our liberty important, but it's also the government's responsibility to inform, create health and well-being for its people, and that the actual wellness of its people is the primary indicator of a successful government. And I think if we are looking at our health data, if we're looking at our metrics, our government has been failing us in that respects. And so, and there's a lot of layers around privatization of medicine, the incentives around, creating care and care opportunities. But yeah, ultimately, that's where I land. That it's both our government regulating corporate responsibility, or our corporate actors actually caring about their products and how their products impact community, and creating better products for people.
Do you want to leave us with a hope for Atlantans and Georgians in this moment or in the public health realm?
I think my hope is that we restructure our relationships with each other. We think about that social contract, like how are we accountable to each other in this moment? In a world that is intentionally distracting us, that, pulls us closer, certainly to our families, and I think that's warranted. But how do we sort of expand our social circles and our networks and be accountable to people? I think that is a new future that I would really love to see for Atlanta.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. That's our show today. Always a helpful reminder that the technology era makes so much possible, and we have to remember what's important, what we should be rooting for, and what outcomes we really want to see. And then we can point these systems and technologies and our focus towards creating the better tomorrow that our hearts know is possible and that we want to see for Atlanta and Georgia and the world more broadly. So Matthew, thank you for carrying that vision and what you're working to enable. Thank you all for listening to the Macon Atlanta podcast. As always, welcome your ideas and input, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.